Professor Helpman is the Galen L. Stone Professor of International Trade at Harvard University. He is a co-founder of the New Trade Theory and the New Growth Theory, which emphasize the roles of economies of scale and imperfect competition. Notably, he has served as a member of the advisory board of the Bank of Israel and the Council for National Planning and the National Council for Research and Development. Professor Helpman has also served on the editorial boards of several scientific journals and as the co-editor of the Journal of International Economics and as the editor of the European Economic Review. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Helpman.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to participate in this event. And I'll try to give you a broad overview of developments about thinking on international trade, which is an important component of globalization. So in terms of background, I want to know that there has been remarkable growth of world trade since World War II, but that this growth has not been a continuous process. So for example, the first well-known globalization process that lasted between 1817 and 1914 with the beginning of World War I, was halted eventually by the war. And between the two world wars, trade declined substantially. And also, if you look at more recent data, then following the financial crisis of 2008, there has been a very large decline in the volume of trade, as you will see soon. What grew particularly fast is growth in manufacturers for most of the period, but in more recent times, growth of service trade has been tremendous. And services have become a very important component in international exchange. Leading exporters or traders are China, the US, Germany, and Japan. But there are sizable differences in how much countries trade as a fraction of their gross domestic product. So, for example, low-income countries typically export about a quarter of their GDP, and middle-income countries about a little bit over 1/3, and the rich countries export more than 40% of their GDP. So this gives you some sense of who is trading and how much is traded. If you look at merchandise trade, which is the biggest trade component, you see here its evolution since a couple of years before the financial crisis. At its peak, it was about $18–19 trillion, which is approximately the size of the US economy, which is a little bigger than this. But this means that trade is very important as part of the general economic activity in the world economy. And as I promised before, you can see here that the financial crisis brought about a significant decline in world trade. So who do the countries trade with, and what are the obstacles to trade? So to begin with, countries trade mostly with close neighbors, which means that transport costs or other impediments which are geographically related play an important role. And this has been known at least since 1962, when the Dutch economy, Jan Tinbergen, provided evidence on the importance of impediments to trade. And then another important element has been the fragmentation of production that enabled growth of trade in intermediate inputs and the emergence on a much larger scale of foreign direct investment, which means activities of multinational corporations. So about 2/3 of world trade consists of intermediate inputs. And for this reason, obviously, trade in intermediate inputs is very important. It's very important to understand how obstacles to trade in intermediate affect economies. And I'll come back to this a little later. But 1/3 of world trade is what we call intra-firm, which means trade between different units of the same corporation. So this involves, of course, trade of multinational corporations. It can be trade between the parent firm and the subsidiary or across subsidiaries. And this is now about 1/3 of world trade. So as you can see, multinational corporations play a big role. And for this reason, it's important to understand their behavior and how they are affected by other developments. Another point which is very important more recently is the growth of what we call global supply chains or global value chains. So this is a process whereby, say, a British firm imports intermediate inputs from, say, Indonesia. But the Indonesian producers might use intermediate inputs from other neighboring countries like Thailand or Vietnam or China in order to produce the intermediate input that the British firm would use. At the same time, other intermediate inputs the British firm may be importing from Taiwan or Singapore or Ireland or France. So there is a very complex web of relationships that lead to the production of the final product. And what this graph describes is the share of these supply chains in total world trade. And as you see, it has increased from about 37% in 1970 to more than 50% more recently. So to understand world trade requires, in fact, to understand how these global supply chains operate. So here is a simple product, which is a bicycle. And what it shows you is that countries that manufacture the bicycle, they often import saddles from China, Italy, and Spain, frames from China, Vietnam, and Italy, brakes from Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia, and so on. And this is a simple product. If you were to look at a figure that entails a car, you'll see, of course, a much richer structure of sourcing from a host of different countries. And if you were to look at a similar figure for an airplane, you'll be dazzled by the number of components that are produced in different parts of the world. So this type of relationships is what fuels trade along these global supply chains. So how has trade analysis evolved? So I'll give you a little bit of historical background. So the neoclassical view of international trade that you have presumably studied if you took an international trade course has its root in 19th century development. So we always start with Ricardo's 1817 book, provided the theory of comparative advantage, which explains trade flows by differences across sectors in relative productivity levels and differences across countries in the pattern of this variation across sectors. Now, the interesting thing about Ricardo is that he developed this simple theory of trade, not because necessarily that he was interested in trade per se, but he was involved in the debate about the Corn Laws in England, and he advocated the repeal of the Corn Laws. In order to explain why tariffs are detrimental, he developed this particular theory. But you know, these type of developments are very slow because, as you know, the Corn Laws were abolished only about 30 years after he wrote his book. So it takes a long time to convince people that trade policy of the type that England adopted during the Napoleonic Wars was not particularly good for England itself. The next important step took place about 100 years later, when a Swedish economic historian by the name of Eli Heckscher tried to understand trade between Eastern and Western Europe. And what he noticed was that the Western Europe exported to the East mostly manufactured products and imported mostly grain like wheat. And he developed an insight which was based on the notion that there are differences across countries in the composition of factors of production, and therefore countries that have a lot of land relative to labor will export agricultural products, and countries that have relatively more labor might be exporting manufactured products. And he used this to explain trade between Eastern and Western Europe. In fact, this is one of the most beautiful papers ever written in international trade because it has no equations, but it's highly analytical, and it tells a story which is much more sophisticated than what I told you. So Heckscher's insights were further developed by one of his students by the name of Bertil, and this became known as the Heckscher-Ohlin theory of international trade. Now, all these insights borrowed from what these people observed in the 19th century, in which most of trade was what we call intersectoral. So one country might be exporting agricultural products and importing chemical products. Another country might be exporting furniture and importing car, and so on. And this was suitable for the structure of trade in the 19th century, where specialization was mostly sectoral specialization. However, in the 1960s and 1970s, new evidence emerged that led to a reconsideration of this neoclassical trade theory. So one observation that play a role in this change is that a large fraction of trade took place between industries. So if we go back to what I just said a minute ago, when you look at, say, British trade, you'll see that the UK exports chemical products and it imports chemical products. It exports cars and it imports cars. So this is what we call intra-industry trade. And in fact, in most of the rich countries, this type of trade is the larger fraction. So you can decompose trade flows into intersectoral and intra-industry. And in most countries, at least at the high level of development, the majority of trade will be within industries. The other point that became important for further development was that people noticed that if you relied on the neoclassical view of international trade, namely across sectors, then we should observe larger volumes of trade across countries that are different from each other, either in relative productivity across sectors, according to Ricardo, or in factor composition, according to Heckscher and Ohlin. However, when you look at trade data, what you see is that countries that are very similar to each other trade very large volumes. And in fact, most of trade in those years when people started to note it was across similar countries. And the final point, which had to wait for many years to be picked up by trade theorists, is that the response to trade liberalization in Europe took place mostly within industries rather than across industries. So as you know, in 1957, a custom union was formed in Europe that grew over time and became the European Custom Union, and is now the large European community. And a Hungarian economist by the name of Bela Balassa noted in 1965, by looking at whatever data was available at the time, and it wasn't very good, these data, but this is what he had to work with, that in response to the formation of these custom unions, a lot of the adjustment took place within countries rather than, within sectors rather than across sectors. Now, the first two observations in these three led to a reformulation of trade theory in the 1980s. And this theory addressed these challenges in a particular way. And what is this way? It suggested that instead of thinking in neoclassical terms, where goods within sectors are homogeneous, and in which there is competition so that there is marginal cost pricing in every sector, we should think about sectors as consisting of goods that are similar but not identical, namely by introducing what we call product differentiation. So when you think about, say, a Volkswagen car, it's not identical to a Fiat car, and Volkswagen itself is producing a variety of brands of its car. And this is similarly for clothing and furniture and other manufactured products. So this distinction is important if there is demand for a variety of goods in different countries, so that I may want to wear an Italian shirt in addition to American shirt, and an Italian professor may prefer a French shirt together with an Italian shirt rather than some other country's shirts. So this is the idea of product differentiation. And then the point is that if there is product differentiation, then every producer who specializes in a particular variety gains automatically market power. So you cannot talk anymore about marginal cost pricing and perfect competition. So you need some alternative to this. And the alternative proposed at the time was monopolistic competition that plays a very big role, not only in trade theory, but also in macroeconomics now, in economic growth, and in other fields. So the scholars who developed this theory adopted these two assumptions or deviations from the neoclassical approach, namely product differentiation and monopolistic competition. Using these new analytical models helped to explain the first two phenomena that I mentioned on the previous slides, namely intra-industry trade and large trade volumes across similar countries. And the insight comes from the fact that if there is a lot of intra-industry trade, because people in the US like Italian shirts and French shirts and UK shirts in addition to the American shirts, and similarly in other countries, then this naturally leads to large volumes of trade between countries that are similar. So this was a sort of advance, and it also provided an underpinning to what's known as the gravity equation in international trade, which was developed, as I mentioned before, by Jan Tinbergen in 1962. And this is an empirically very important equation that has many forms and shape these days, including for very rich analytical structures. But in addition, this development provided new underpinnings for the analysis of multinational firms. And as I mentioned before, multinational firms are extremely important because about 1/3 of world trade is conducted within the bounds of the multinational corporations. Now, further developments along these lines proceeded to economic growth. And in fact, this approach of product differentiation and monopolistic competition lends itself naturally to an analysis of economic growth based on innovation, which allows you to analyze the interdependence across countries. So if innovation is important, then the technological spillovers across countries become important. And conduits of spillovers across countries can be driven by either international trade or the activities of multinational corporations. So this generates very strong interdependence across growth processes in different countries. So if trade per se generates interdependence, and we become dependent on our trade partners, and I'll come back to this point later again, then our growth potential also becomes dependent on who are the countries with which we interact, either in terms of trade, foreign direct investment, and the like. And the next step is to know that in the 1990s, new evidence emerged from new firm-level data sets. I'm talking about large-scale data sets that pushed research in this field into new directions, gaining new understandings. So what have we learned from these new data sets? So the first point is that only a small fraction of firms export, that exporters sell most of their output domestically, that exporters are typically bigger than non-exporters. In addition, they are more productive, both as measured by total factor productivity or labor productivity, whichever measure you prefer. And moreover, they pay higher wages. So these first four phenomena triggered a reformulation of trade theory, building on the theory that was developed in the 1980s, namely using product differentiation and monopolistic competition by enriching the economic structure to allow what we call within firm heterogeneity. So what does it mean within firm heterogeneity? This means that when we look at the typical industrial sectors, then not all firms are alike. Some firms are bigger, others are smaller. There is a correlation between the size of firms and their productivity. And there are other characteristics that vary across firms. Now, these characteristics are very important for a host of economic issues, not only for international trade. And I'll mention one of them later on. So this approach to international trade that enriches the framework to allow for heterogeneity of firms within industries provides actually a very natural framework for studying a host of issues. So in particularly, and this was part of the impetus for this development, it helps you to understand the impact of trade liberalization on within industry reallocations. So this question that was posed by Bela Balazs in 1965 after he observed the formation of the European Customs Union received a new insight from this later development. Now, what is so important about this? What is important is that people found in a variety of studies, including in different countries, such as Canada or Chile, say, that in the face of trade liberalization, and this could have arisen as a result of the formation of a free trade agreement or just a decline of tariffs in one of the WTO rounds of negotiations. What happens is in these situations is that the trade liberalization squeezes out the least productive firms from the industry, and it leads to market share reallocation from less productive, smaller firms to more productive, larger firms. So it leads to a serious reallocation of resources across firms within the industry. And on top of this, there can be some reallocation across sectors, but as Balassa found at the time, the dominant factor seems to be the reallocation within industries. Moreover, this new insight became very relevant for understanding the operation of multinational corporations. And the theory and the empirics of multinationals changed in a very important way in view of this development. So this becomes relevant for patterns of integration and outsourcing, both at home and abroad, and more broadly for the way global firms organize their activities. So one feature that was integrated in this view is contract theory. And I imagine that Oliver Hart talked about it 2 weeks ago when he gave his lecture here. So you can imagine that the view of trade has been extremely enriched by going from the neoclassical view to this much richer composition that is using product differentiation, monopolistic competition, within firm heterogeneity, a much bigger role for the operation of multinational corporation, and the global supply chains. One important area in which these developments provided insight is on the impact of trade on inequality. So the neoclassical approach to international trade has a particular channel through which trade affects inequality. And this channel has been studied extensively, and it had been studied particularly in the 1980s when the college wage premium increased dramatically in the US, the UK, and many other countries. And what happened was that what these studies found was that you couldn't attribute much of the rise in this type of inequality to international trade. And the question that is still lingering is, are there other channels through which trade or globalization more broadly can affect inequality? And this type of theory that I described now has a very interesting channel that can affect inequality. And this is wage inequality within industries. So if you look at rich countries, take the US, for example, and you ask the question, what is causing, you try to decompose the inequality in wages, and you ask the question, how much of this inequality is driven as a result of inequality of wages across sectors, and how much is driven by inequality of wages within the sectors, then the majority of inequality is within sectors. So the fact that different firms pay different wages, and in particularly the bigger firms pay higher wages, and firms that export are typically big, so they pay relatively high wage premiums. This provides a handle on how international trade can affect inequality. And this has been studied for a variety of countries, like the US, Sweden, Brazil, and so on. So this is another aspect of globalization that received a new insight from this new approach. And finally, this also provided a new handle on how economic growth driven by globalization can affect inequality. So in some of the simpler analytical models, what you see is that a country that integrates into a world economy grows faster. It grows faster because it gets some productivity spillovers from foreign countries through its foreign trade. But at the same time, this generates higher inequality of wage earners within industries. So you gain faster growth at the cost of higher inequality. And the question then becomes, what can we do about this trade-off? And other policies, for example, that can be beneficial. Maybe we prefer to grow a little slower, but have less inequality. And what is a good way in which this can be achieved? And finally, this also leads to a new analysis of the global supply chains that I mentioned earlier. So here is just a simple calculation to see why these reallocations are important. So this is from a set of studies of the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement of 1989, before NAFTA. And what you see here in the red frame is how much labor productivity changes as a result of the exit of the least productive firms, and how much due to market share reallocation from less productive to more productive firms. And you see that the numbers are very large. It's a little over 4% for each one of these channels. Okay, so to move to more recent events, I will discuss briefly, and this will be the last topic, I'll discuss these global supply chains. So the distinctive features of global supply chains, as reported in the World Bank about last year, is that they are possible. They were made possible by fragmentation of production. I mentioned this before. Importantly, they import surge costs. Because of the uniqueness of various products that are produced within this manufacturing industry, a buyer of an intermediate input has to find a supplier, and this is a costly process. And this buyer has to be matched with a supplier who can produce a product with the characteristics that the final good producer needs. Interestingly, despite the fact that often there are no long-term contracts involved, there's durability in the relationships between buyers and suppliers. And in fact, in many data sets, for example, in the French data set, what happens is that a buyer of intermediate inputs has typically one or two suppliers. There isn't much diversification across multiple suppliers in multiple countries. So there were barriers to trade that escalated when Trump became president in the US. So the background is that in the G20 countries, the 20 largest economy, tariffs on final consumer goods were typically 70 to 75% larger than on intermediate inputs. And in the US, they were about 4 times as high as tariffs on intermediate inputs. And in fact, the average tariffs on intermediate inputs was very low in the US. It was under 1%. But then with President Trump coming in, tariffs were imposed primarily on intermediate inputs, also some on final consumer goods. And these tariffs on intermediate inputs, they obviously disturb the global supply chains. So this is why I'm mentioning this here. And what's known that phase 1 of the deal between the US and China about 93% of the intermediates were covered by tariffs. And what this graph shows you here is you have the red one, which is the average tariff on final consumer goods that the US imports from China. And the blue one describes the average tariff on intermediate inputs that the US imports from China. And you see, for most of the time, tariffs on final consumer goods were higher than on intermediate inputs, but both were quite low. They were, as you can see here, below 10%. And on intermediates, they were closer to 2%. But then with the Trump tariffs, you see this rapid rise in protection, and it's biased particularly toward intermediate inputs. And in fact, by the end of this period, 2019, tariffs on intermediates are higher than tariffs on final consumer goods. And this is an interesting story, which I don't have time to tell you because China retaliated with tariff of its own, and they targeted the tariffs toward industries in politically sensitive states, in particularly towards swing states in the electoral US system. And if you look at the anecdotal evidence, then in response to these tariffs, companies started to shift sourcing away from China towards a variety of low-cost countries such as Vietnam and Thailand. This was true in a variety of industries such as electronic and furniture. Many companies did the shift, some big ones like Samsonite or Cisco Systems. So this is all anecdotal evidence, and a statistical analysis of this shift finds that it is really broad-based. So the question is, how can we evaluate these shifts? Because after all, as I mentioned, these global supply chain have special features, and this introduces special costs. So there are the new search costs that come with it. There is renewed bargaining with old suppliers and definitely with new ones. There's trade diversion into typically higher cost countries. They are higher cost without the tariff, but they become lower with the tariff because the tariff is not imposed on Vietnam or Thailand in this story. So there are a variety of studies that look at it, which I don't have time to discuss here. But if you look at some simple simulations of this theory, of the type of model that can capture these features, then a tariff of 20%, which is within the range imposed by Trump, can cause a welfare loss which is about 3.5% of a sector's revenue. Now, this is considered a pretty large loss, which means that these tariffs are in principle quite costly. And the last point I want to make about supply chains is that there is a lot of apprehension about these supply chains. So this figure comes from a McKinsey Global Institute report about global supply chains. And the left panel gives you some estimates of how much damage they can cause. But I've underlined the right panel in the red frame to note that the frequency of disruptions is actually quite large. So, for example, disruptions of between 1 and 2 weeks of a supply chain happens to a company on average every 2 years. And disruptions of 2 to 4 weeks happen every 3 years. And disruptions of more than 2 months happen about every 5 years. So these are non-trivial disruptions, and you might have read in the newspaper that car manufacturers suffered from disruptions in the provision of chips, and this halted production. When there was an earthquake in Japan a couple of years ago, this caused severe disruption and so on. So one thing which is important about these global supply chains is that on the one hand, they lower cost, on the other, they introduce interdependence across countries. This can be good in many ways, but it also causes problems which are reflected in these disruptions. And I've been engaged in some research recently that tries to understand how important these disruptions might be. So to summarize, world trade has rapidly transformed since World War II, both in terms of volume and the characteristics of trade. And since the 1980s, the IT revolution led to fragmentation of production. And this led to large-scale outsourcing, to offshoring, and to the emergence of very rich and complex global supply chains. So research on trade and globalization has been challenged time and again by developments in the real economy, by the transformation of the world trading system, but not only the world trading system, but also the transformation of the world economy with the integration of countries that belong to the Soviet bloc, and they were integrated into the world trading system after 1989, with the emergence of Asia as a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse, and so on. So the result is that those of us who work on globalization issues, they are caught in a constant race between events and research findings. And often we have to deal with new issues before we properly understand old ones. But this causes a lot of excitement within the field, and I invite all of you to join our effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Helpman, for that interesting talk. I think the audience probably has a much more complex understanding of the issue now, since you covered everything from the historical background of trade theories to the new developments in the form of trade disruptions to the global supply chains. So now moving on to the question and answer session. If anyone wishes to ask a live question, please use the raise hand function or the thumbs up reaction button from Reactions tab at the bottom bar. Ansh, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you for that insightful talk, Dr. Helpman. I have a question regarding one of your last slides where you talked about disruptions in global supply chains. In the view of COVID-19 and the impact it has created on global supply chains, would you say that the impact on the disruptions of global supply chains and the apprehension about it can be of a permanent nature, or do you think it will subside in the near future?
Well, it can turn into a permanent feature because both companies and governments might choose to reevaluate their attitude towards these global supply chains. So, for example, President Biden has appointed a task force to examine the US participation in these global supply chains and try to formulate a policy towards them. And I'm sure that the other governments will also try to reevaluate their attitudes and policies toward them. But what one has to bear in mind is that these global supply chains emerged in order to improve specialization. And there is no doubt that many countries gain productivity through access to these global supply chains. So the issue is, of course, as often as in other cases in economics, that there are some benefits, but then there are some costs involved. And at the end of the day, we have to make a cost-benefit analysis, either at the company level, at the country level, or maybe at the systemic level. So if there will come better times for dealing with international economic issues in an intelligent way, maybe this will be one of the issues on the table.
Thank you, sir. Does anyone else wish to ask a live question? Please use the raise hand function or the thumbs up button. Seeing none, I will take a question from the chat. Shivam Gujral asks, you talked about how trade theories have changed over time and adapted with the new innovations and relationships found in this segment. My question is pertaining to the increasing research within the realms of environmental spillover effects. How do you think research in such areas and concepts like the pollution havens hypothesis may help modify/shape the future of trade theories?
But there has been actually quite a lot of research on trade and the environment. But my understanding is that the pollution havens hypothesis hasn't gained much traction in empirical work. So of course there are examples in which countries change their trade policy, and this expands production of pollution-intensive products in some other countries. But overall, the effects that have been found were relatively small. As always in economics, this can change because what we find depends on the data sets that we have. If we want to do counterfactual exercises, which is very important when we deal with policy issues, for example, then we have to commit to a world view in terms of a particular analytical model. And as I have noted during this lecture, these models have been changing over time in view of developments in the world trading system. So this may change also over time. But at this point, I don't see any particular channel through which environmental issues will play a big role in international trade. Of course, environmental issues are very important for other reasons. And there are lots of studies in recent years which show the type of damages that can be caused. So I would say that the link between environmental issues and trade are still an open question in terms of magnitudes of interdependence.
Thank you for that answer, Professor. Another question, Kashish Gupta asks, network theory is an emerging field in economics, especially international trade. Is there any way it can be used to analyze international trade? In your opinion, are there any interesting research topics budding economists should look at?
Yeah, so network theory is, I would say, more than emerging technique for analysis in economics. And it has penetrated also international trade. It's not broadly used, but it has been used quite effectively on some occasions. So for example, on this issue of global supply chain, there's obviously room to build models that relied on network theory. But this has not yet been achieved. And for example, my discussion of disruptions of global supply chains can also benefit from a network theory approach. So again, these issues are open, and everybody is invited to make advances on this as well as on other topics. You know, economic research has one huge advantage. There's free entry. So everybody can try to contribute. And if you have an idea and you know how to handle it, jump in and just do it.
As following the vulnerabilities exposed within global value chains by the pandemic, do you predict a wave of onshoring? And if so, in which sectors?
Well, I'm not very good with predicting. I'm much better with just analyzing. There is a view that there will be more onshoring as a result of the pandemic. But I think it depends very much on how quickly the health issues will be resolved. If they linger on longer, then there will be more. And if they linger less, there will be less. So it's partly the prediction that one wants to make, it partly relates on what one predicts about the speed with which the health issues will be resolved. The fact of the matter is that if you take, for example, the Trump tariffs, one idea behind them, which he promoted, was that this will bring back economic activity into the US and it will increase jobs and so on. But the studies that we have seen of how tariffs, especially on intermediate goods, affect employment, they don't support this view of the world. So it may well be that some countries will decide that in view of what we have seen in the last year, they should engage in some policies that encourage companies to bring some of their economic activity from abroad home. But I don't think that we know how to do it in an effective way, which is actually beneficial. So we'll have to wait for more research, for more thinking, and it remains an open question.
Thank you. So for one last question, Mark.
Thank you so much, Dr. Helpman, for this interesting talk. You walk us through the importance of FDI at the beginning of this session, and I had a question on this. Deeming that world FDI inflows and the value of new greenfield investment projects decreased by 49% and 37% respectively, according to the UNCTAD. Which could be some feasible and effective policies that governments, especially those highly dependent on tourism investments, such as some Western countries like Spain, could implement to recover from this downturn? Thank you.
Do you mean a decline in foreign direct investment? I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Yes. FDI inflows, a decline of FDI inflows, yes.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that one has to necessarily recover from changes in FDI flows. To begin with, FDI flows are measured as part of the capital account, and they don't reflect necessarily shifts in the activity of multinational corporations that we care about, which is how much they produce, how many people they employ, with whom do they trade. And different countries have taken different views of how to encourage or discourage foreign direct investment or activities of multinational corporations. So, for example, many developing countries in the 1960s, they encouraged foreign investment, and the view was that if foreign firms operate in the developing country, there will be some learning process that will spill over to domestic workers, to domestic firms, And there has been quite a bit of evidence that indeed domestic firms, especially small firms that sold products to the multinationals, they gained productivity and wages went up and so on. But nevertheless, at some point, the view was that multinationals exploit local economies and we should put barriers on foreign direct investment. Now, many countries still encourage to some degree multinational to operate in their countries. For example, it's not an example because it's an extreme case. Ireland has a lot of foreign direct investment, and a big fraction of the labor force in manufacturing is employed actually by foreign companies. And this was an explicit policy, and in the Irish case, it seemed to have been very successful. But these type of policies at the margin, it's not necessarily the case that you want to encourage foreign direct investment. So I don't know the Spanish case, and I don't have a view about it. But you know, Spain has really excellent economists. I'm sure that they can figure out what will be the right way to proceed.
That brings us to the end of the event. A big thank you from the Economist Society to Professor Helpman for taking out time from your busy schedule to come speak with us. And thank you to everyone in the audience for making our last event so great. Thank you for all your questions as well.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.